2020 feels like the year of Charlie Brown, doesn't it? It seems like everything that can go wrong has gone wrong. And as soon as one thing seems like it's getting a little better, the football gets jerked away, and we are flying through the air of uncertainty again. We probably all identified with Charlie Brown at some point in time, or at least a little bit. Grim outlook, heavy sighs, one thing going wrong after another. But Charlie Brown was always going around with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Charlie Brown is kind of a lovable goof, and we can identify with him when things aren't going great. But Charlie Brown was always worried about his personal problems, right? Things that were going wrong in his life, you know, how he felt, the red-haired girl that he liked, his baseball team, his dog. But things have kind of taken a darker turn this year where we don't have just our own problems on our shoulders. We have the problems of the world on our shoulders. Every time you turn around, there's something else. There's the coronavirus, there's the economy, there's injustice, there's riots. And each of these problems are so big and so serious that they've affected us personally. And in a way that's not really so cute and adorable as Charlie Brown, each one of us is struggling with the weight of these problems. And now we don't have just the weight of our own personal problems on our shoulders, we have the weight of the world. There's so many times when you're reading the Bible that it feels like the Bible was written yesterday for what we need today. And when you read the book of Habakkuk in 2020, you can't help but think that. Habakkuk is complaining to God about how bad things had gotten in his corner of the world. God's own people were violent and rebellious and turning away from God. And God's answer to Habakkuk is that things are actually about to get much, much worse. Not just for Habakkuk himself, although that was probably true, and not just for the 2 tribes of Israel that were left in the land, although that was definitely true, but actually for the whole world, things were about to get worse. These vicious, heartless Babylonians were about to invade not just his country, but take over the whole world. And so once again, the weight of this is starting to press down on Habakkuk, just like the weight of the world is pressing down on our shoulders. Humanly speaking, things don't look like they're getting better. And yet, God is working. God had already told Habakkuk as he gets ready and leads up to our text this morning that Ramon just read, he had already told him, look among the nations, observe, be astonished, wonder, because I am doing something in your days you would not believe if you were told. God, even in the middle of disturbing chaos, is up to something. He's doing something, even if we can't see it. And quite honestly, if he told us exactly what he was doing, we might not believe it. Habakkuk was overwhelmed with the idea, with the injustice that this proud one that God introduced in verse 4, whose soul was not right within him, the Babylonians, that they were about to invade and conquer. And God's answer to Habakkuk, an answer to that problem, is to look at the situation by faith. So how do we get the weight of the world shifted off our shoulders? Well, our text this morning shows us how. It's given in the form of 5 woes. The woes are just pronouncements of doom. It's an announcement of judgment that's coming. There's 5 of them in this passage, and we're going to look at the first 3 this morning. As we looked at last time, the people who are actually giving these woes are the very people that the Babylonians had invaded. And so they're giving these 5 woes, of course, authored ultimately by God. And they're given to us in very tight, articulate poetry. There's actually 9 verses in our text. And so each of the woes is 3 verses. And each of those verses and each of those woes deals with a different thing. So we're going to take them kind of individually as we go through the woes. But isn't it interesting that in the middle of really depressing chaos of the land being invaded, God is giving his answer in beautiful poetry. Even in the middle of this, God is doing something wonderful and doing something beautiful. So, first of all, let's look at the weight of the world's sin. Let's look at what these woes actually are. It's easy for us to kind of just get discouraged in general about how things are going and say, well, everything's going bad out there. Nothing's really going the way it's supposed to be. But let's look at the weight of this sin of the world that we can so easily put on our shoulder. And these woes, obviously, these pronouncements of judgments apply perfectly to the Babylonians, but they also apply to every society that rejects God. So the first woe is for the world's materialism. Verse 6, will not all of these are the ones that had been conquered and invaded, take up a taunt song against him, even mockery and insinuations against him, and say, woe to him who increases what is not his. For how long? And makes himself rich with loans. So this woe is talking about the looting and plundering of other nations. And it gives the idea of a country that comes and attacks another nation to take all of their stuff. It's just like somebody who goes and runs up a bunch of debt. Somebody who goes and maxes out all their credit cards and starts using some of their credit cards to pay off their other credit cards. Somebody who gets the loan for the nicest car that they can get and gets a loan for the biggest house that they could possibly be given. And we all know how that's going to end, right? It's only temporary. You can collect all of these other things because you live for these material things, but it's only a matter of time before those things get taken away. It's not real, lasting wealth of any kind. It's going to get taken away very shortly. And that's the picture here that God uses for the Babylonians and for any nation that attacks another nation just to get their things. They think that they're accumulating all this wealth, but it's only a matter of time until these possessions are reclaimed. Skip down to the next woe in our text in verse 9. The next woe we'll call the world's selfishness. God says to these nations, woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. So this is the woe for people who they take this evil gain. They've taken things from other people that isn't theirs. And then what do they use it for? They use it to try and make themselves safe. They put their nest on high. A nest was, in that time, was an idea of safety. Obviously a bird builds the nest up as high as they can because it's away from all the other predators. And they think that by doing that, they can be delivered from the hand of calamity. They've made themselves absolutely secure. Remember in Jesus' story in Luke chapter 12, where there was a rich man who had a huge crop. And of course, in this case, the huge crop wasn't taken from someone else. He just got the crop. But he's living for materialistic things. And then when he has all this extra stuff, he says, well, I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for you for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. So here we have the idol of security. The idea of taking the wealth that you have, in this case of the Babylonians, it wasn't even wealth that was theirs. They had taken it from someone else, and then using it for only your own security, making sure that you have it made and that you can't be touched from now on. Then the third woe is for the world's violence. If you skip down to the next woe in verse 18, it says, woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. So this is a condemnation of the violence and bloodshed that is so often seen in our world. This rebellion against God is growing. It started by just attacking other nations, and then it comes to making your own house, your own empire secure so that you can't be touched. And then it progresses to now you're taking over a whole town in order to make a name for yourself, in order to show what a legacy you have because of what you've done. And in order to get that legacy, you actually are willing to kill people. It doesn't matter who dies. It doesn't matter how many people get killed, because a country wants this territory, or a country wants this town to start it. So these woes cover materialism, selfishness, and violence. It covers everything that we know about these invading Babylonians. Just a couple of things you'll notice that they all have in common. They all have to do with the physical, right? Every single one of these woes is against the idolatry of living for material things. It's the resources that other countries have that makes you attack them. It's building up your house or your fortress to make sure that you can keep everything that you've gotten. And it's taking over land or taking over a city for yourself. There's no thought of God. There's no concern for a soul. There's no worry about heaven or focus on the spiritual. It's just the physical. And notice how each of these sins destroys other people. It kills other people. The physical wealth, these physical things are so valued that nations don't care who dies in order for them to get it. They want the resources, they want the safety, they want the stability, they want the city to own it, and they don't care who has to die in order for them to get it. And notice here too that this passage is directly addressing national sins. Most of the time when we talk about sin in the Bible, it's talking about individual sins, and certainly national sins are still committed by individuals who will be held accountable individually. But notice here that this is addressing nations that do this, countries that do this. Individuals act in rebellion to God, but individuals, it's almost like they put all their sinfulness together to be able to make it even more sinful. Like the Tower of Babel, where all of the people got together and said, we're going to build a tower that's going to basically rival God. It's going to get us into heaven itself. And that is what countries that are in rebellion against God do. Whole countries stand themselves up against God and try to take the place of God. They try to say that what God says doesn't matter, and they want to make a name for themselves. They want to get resources for themselves. They want to get safety and security for themselves. So sinful humanity is trying to follow in Satan's footsteps, to be like God, to provide the things that really only God can give us, but to get it ourselves and to get it our own way. So from the Tower of Babel to the Babylonians, to the Roman Empire, to the British Empire, you can flip open any history book and you'll find examples of materialism, selfishness, and violence. And of course, it's not something that's just in history, right? This is something that's still going on today. It describes basically every current event thing that you watch today. It has some kind of example of materialism, selfishness, and violence. In most of our lifetimes, in 1994, it was in Rwanda that 800,000 people were killed in 3 months in tribal fighting in Africa. Genocide, 100,000 people that died. So this isn't something that we just look back into the history books of, wow, things used to be really bad. Nations used to kill each other. And of course, this is just scratching the surface. There's so many more examples in recent history. It was just this past week that we heard about forced sterilization and slave labor of millions of people in China. We don't hear a lot about the situation in Yemen very much. Yemen is a small country next to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has been at war with these people for decades. And with our country's weapons and help, they've waged a systematic war against the people in Yemen. And right now, 50,000 children die every year from malnutrition in Yemen. 50,000 children just from malnutrition. That's not even talking about the war and the bombs and all those other things that are going on there. So it's still happening today all around the world. And we would like to say that our own country is exempt. We would like to say that America is different. And we have a lot of things to be thankful for in this country. There's no doubt about that. But our country has our own history with slavery and unnecessary wars. And we could even just point to the fact that today in America, 3,000 unborn children are killed every day in abortions. 3,000 unborn children every day. So I don't really think I need to spend a long time convincing you that the world is filled with materialism, selfishness, and violence today. I don't think that that's a hard sell, right? No one's going to say, oh no, actually things are going great. But the question is, how do we keep these things from filling our hearts? How do we keep these things off of our shoulders? Because it's too much for us to carry. If you watch the news, it's almost too heartbreaking to watch. If you don't watch the news and you're just on social media, there's news in social media and all of this bad news that's coming up there. And if you're smart enough probably to turn off social media a lot, then before long, someone's going to say to you, hey, did you hear that such and such happened? It just seems like there's bad news everywhere. And, again, Charlie Brown was discouraged about how his baseball team was doing, but we are starting to get discouraged with things that are much bigger and that are much darker. So how do we walk through our day without these slumped shoulders of the weight of the world? Well, first of all, we're going to need new eyes to look at the world. Because as we've already seen in this passage, we live by faith. We're seeing the progression in this book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is only 3 chapters long. And Habakkuk starts out in chapter 1 by saying, God, why are you letting all this happen? How long are you going to let this go on? And then in chapter 2, we see Habakkuk waiting patiently in the watchtower to see what God's going to answer. And if you skip ahead to the very end of the book, in Habakkuk 3, Habakkuk says, if there's no fruit on the vines, if there's no food in the fields, there's no cattle in the stalls, it doesn't matter because I am still going to exalt in my God. I think I might have gotten behind in my PowerPoint. All right, went back one. Yeah, there we go. Habakkuk 3:18. I will exalt in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. How did Habakkuk get from discouragement and angry questions of God all the way to, I will exalt in the God of my salvation no matter what happens? How did he get there? He got there by faith. He got there by learning to look at the world with different eyes. Now, it didn't take any faith to see the world's situation, right? We can see that with our own eyes. Habakkuk already knew things were bad. That's why he started talking to God in the first place. And when he goes to tell God about how bad everything's going, God's like, well, actually, things are about to get a lot worse, Habakkuk. But it takes faith to see the world's destination. Not just the world's situation. It takes faith to see the world's destination. Every single one of these woes doesn't just give us the world's situation, it also gives us the world's destination. So we're going to go back through these, and let me show you how we start to get the weight of the world lifted off of our shoulders. When we see the destination of the world, we start to bear a wondrous, more beautiful weight on our souls, that it's much better. The materialism, the selfishness, and the violence of the nations is not going to last forever. So remember how I told you this is poetry that goes back to the same idea over and over again. So we're going to go back through the woes and look at the second verse in each of the woes to see the internal punishment for each one of these sins. There's an external one and there's an internal one. So internally, the world's sin is destined for self-defeat. Sin has a way of limiting itself. We often look at what's going on in the world and it seems like it's unstoppable, right? That's part of what makes it so discouraging. It's not like it's showing signs of petering out on its own. It looks like it's actually getting stronger. And that's what Habakkuk would have seen as the Babylonians were about to sweep in and take over the known world. But God says to him, look with eyes of faith and see that sin is self-defeating. Let me show you that from the text here. The second verse in our text, is the second verse in these woes. He says to Habakkuk, will not your creditors, talking about the Babylonians, and those who collected from you awaken? Indeed, you will become plunder for them. So again, it's going off the same idea of somebody who runs up all this debt. They collected all of this wealth, but only by taking it, by borrowing it from other people. And it was only borrowing. Eventually, it has to go back. It's only a matter of time before the repo man shows up to take the car, or the bank shows up to take the house. So that's what he's saying here. A country that goes and makes its way by taking from other countries, it's only a matter of time until those countries come back for what you've taken. Eventually, the looter gets looted, the aggressor gets attacked, and the thief gets his things stolen. So next, let's just look at what the selfish person, the person who was idolizing safety to make sure that they could protect all of this wealth that they had. God says to them, you have devised a shameful thing for your house by cutting off many peoples, so you are sinning against yourself. So in order to get this safety that they wanted, in order to build this house that was completely protected from everybody else, they cut off all these other people. And in the end, they were the ones that were cut off. They were the ones that were actually sinning against themselves. They thought they were just sinning against other people. They were actually sinning against themselves. They thought they were getting safety, but actually they were getting shame. Basically, sin is like a boomerang that you think that you can make sure that it only affects, you can only hurt other people, but it's only a matter of time until it comes back on you. And I think a good illustration of this is some of the most wealthy, famous people, and you see how they end their life, right? They spend their whole life really not caring about other people, not caring about who they hurt. And they collect maybe all of this wealth and fame to themselves, but then how does their life end? A lot of times very lonely, locked maybe up inside a huge giant house that they had spent all this time accumulating the wealth for, and yet they're alone and they're cut off from everyone else. And then lastly, look at the last kind of internal self-destruction of sin. The people that were trying to make a name for themselves, that were trying to conquer a city and start it, what happens to them? Well, it says in verse 13, is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that people toil for fire and nations grow weary for nothing? God has set it up that the people who try to make a name for themselves actually end up with nothing. The people that spend all this time thinking that they're going to have this lasting legacy, this lasting glory, are actually the ones that end up spending their life on nothing. That it doesn't count for anything. Just as an example, like think about all of the people in the Egyptian empire throughout all of those years, in the officials and the pharaohs that spent so much time trying to make sure that the Egyptian empire and the glory of the Egyptian empire would last. But where is the Egyptian empire today? Think about the Babylonians who thought that they were going to be this glorious, wonderful, lasting people. And yet, where are they today? Think about even more recently in history, think about Hitler and all of the people in his Nazi party who thought that they could take all of those other countries in Europe and they could eventually even take over the world, which is what they wanted to do. And yet, where is their empire today? It's been defeated and it's been left on the dustbin of history. And all of those things that they worked for ended up being for nothing. Remember what it says in the Psalms, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:20, where's the wise man? Where's the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? No matter how big and bad a whole sinful nation might seem right now, God says that it won't last. Their own sin is actually their undoing. Sin is always self-destructive. Even though it doesn't seem like it at the time, it is. One of my favorite cartoons that I like watching with my kids has an evil scientist that is always trying to come up with different ways to take over the world. And his wacky inventions to take over the world never end up working because he always has one fatal flaw to what he came up with. And at one point, he figures out a way to build an entire army of giant killer robots that are going to go and take over the world. And the only mistake he makes is he puts the self-destruct button on the bottom of the robot's feet. So when the robot army takes its first step, they're all, obliterated with their self-destruct button, and that's the end of them. And sin is like that. Not quite that quickly. We wish it were that quickly. But sin is always self-destructive. And isn't that what we need, right? Because we see sin going, it seems like, unchecked in our neighborhoods, in our country. And it seems like nothing's happening to the people who are doing all these wrong things. And so because of that, we start to carry the weight of that on our shoulders. It's not just that we see bad things happening, it's that bad things are happening and it seems like nobody has to pay. But the truth is, sin might flourish for a little while, but sin never leads to true human flourishing. So we have to remember that when we see sin happening, God has already started the punishment against it. That sin is already destroying the people who are doing those things. It might seem huge and unstoppable, but God has already started that process. And I think too often we look at the sin in the world and it seems like we just kind of throw up our hands like, this is unstoppable. This is just horrible. And we forget that God has promised that sin is self-destructive. So not only is sin self-destructive, but sin is also defeated by God. Sin internally kind of defeats itself, and that happens often in this lifetime. But there's also an external punishment that's coming on sin. And that's what the third of each of these verses and these three woes that we're looking at this morning are talking about. So let's go back through these verses one more time and look at the last verse in each of these woes. So here's the first one. Because you have looted many nations, all the remainder of the peoples will loot you, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town and all of its inhabitants. So here, it's not just that the nations are suddenly gathering up and to come back. Here, it's God himself that is saying, you are going to be punished for the things that you have done, for the things that you have stolen. Because you took these things with bloodshed and violence, you are going to have bloodshed and violence put back on you. Remember, it's the victims of the Babylonians that are the ones who are singing this whole song. Babylon would have been in the headlines, and everyone would have been scared of them. Everyone would have said, this is just an unstoppable army. But God has a different opinion. God is showing Habakkuk what the destination of the Babylonians is, not just their situation. So then there's the punishment for those who have taken all of this unjust gain to make their house secure. Instead of just punishment for their victims, this woe has an accountability by creation itself. These people that spent all this time building these secure houses, look what God says about them. He says, surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework. So here, God's creation itself stands up as a witness against what these people have done. The idea here is that it seems like wicked nations can do whatever they want and get away with it. And even a kind of an example today, right? There's all sorts of crime and injustice that we see now because there's cell phone videos and because there's security camera footage that you can watch of a robbery, or maybe it's an abuse by some kind of an authority. And so we look at those things and we say, well, at least we can see these things now. And this person could get in trouble because somebody saw what they did. But it makes us think, well, what about all the bad things that happened that somebody didn't catch on their cell phone video, that there wasn't a security camera there to catch what they did? And what God is saying here is that the rafters and the stones inside these people's houses will stand up as a witness for what they did. They will be held accountable. God basically says, if it's my creation that's there, that means that I'm there too and watching it. Because we have part of the hopelessness and the despair is it seems like these people do this and there's nobody to watch. There's no one to stand up and hold them accountable and say, yes, this is what they did. This is actually the text that Jesus quotes to the Pharisees in the triumphal entry when Jesus is riding in on a donkey. All of Jerusalem is worshiping him and praising him. And the Pharisees are shocked that Jesus is letting this kind of worship go on. Because unless he's God, which he is, they think there's no way that he should be allowing people to worship him like this. And what does Jesus say to them? Jesus says, I tell you, if the crowd was silent, the stones would cry out. There is a witness just from God's creation itself. God's creation itself will not be silent against what has happened. And in that case, it was praising Christ. But in this case, it's talking about the sins of a nation, that even inside their own homes that they think they built to keep themselves secure, it's those homes that are going to actually be the ones, even the beams and the bricks inside of them, that will hold them accountable for what they have done. Nothing is hidden. There's nothing that anyone's going to get away with that won't be punished. So when we start to take the weight of the world on our shoulders, isn't that because we're worried that somebody's going to get away with something? Right? It's not just that we saw something bad was happening, but that if we saw something bad was happening and it seems like they're going to get away with it. But God says that it might seem like there's no one to hold them accountable. There's no one to stand up and say, this is what they really did. But God says, don't worry. If there's no one left to say what they did, the insides of their house will actually stand up. Because God is saying, really, I've seen what happens, and I'm going to hold them to account. No sin is going to go unpunished. God promises that he sees it all, and he's going to punish it all, which means we don't have to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. God is going to handle it. Now, there's one last verse for us to consider. It's the last external consequence to the world's sin. We've seen that sin will be punished, sin will be held accountable, and now in this last woe against the violence of the people who went out to try and defeat a town and start a town to spread their own fame and their own name. But what's the ultimate destination of people who do that? The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. This last line kind of rushes in on our souls like a cool breeze on a warm day, and you just kind of have to close your eyes and enjoy it for a second. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. There's a couple things that kind of make this line in this poetry just jump out at us. Everything else in this whole pronouncement of doom has been negative. It's only bad things that are happening. Here's actually something positive. What is the world's actual true destination? Everything else has been, here's the wicked nation, here's what's going to happen to them. But if you're reading it, you're thinking, wait a second, where do I fit into all of this, right? I've got the weight of these things that are happening on me. What do I do about that? You're reading Habakkuk, and it's telling you, here's what all the Babylonians are like, and we're reading that today and saying, yep, the world's still like that. And if it's not our job to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders, what are we supposed to be carrying? What are we supposed to be focusing on? We're designed to carry something, but it's not the weight of the world's sin. We're designed to carry the weight of the glory of God. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. By faith, we see the final destination of the world. The world is not meant to be filled with materialism, selfishness, and violence. But it's not enough to know that. You need to know what the world will be filled with. What is the world going to be filled with? The world is going to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The word for glory is the word for weightiness or worth, which is why it's interesting that we carry the weightiness of the world and the weightiness of the world's sin even on us, but we were designed to carry a much better weight, something that actually is much heavier, that is much more long-lasting, but it's what we were actually designed to carry. This word for glory is also the word that's used in the Bible for the reputation or the fame of God. Nations are willing to kill in order to spread their fame and their reputation. But ultimately, the world is not going to be filled with the Babylonians' reputation. The world is not going to be filled with the Roman Empire's glory or the United States' fame. What is the ultimate destination of this world? The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. God's glory is his immediate presence. It is to be in the very presence of God himself. It was God's glory that met Moses on the mountaintop. It was God's glory that filled the temple. In Isaiah 6, when he gets a glimpse into the throne room of heaven, the seraphim, the angels in the room are singing. The whole earth is full of his glory. But God's glory is something that you experience. It's something that you know. Notice what it says here in the text, because it doesn't say that the earth is going to be filled with the glory of the Lord. Because in one sense, the earth is already filled with the glory of the Lord. But there is a day coming when the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, like the earth covers the sea. See, you might have somebody ask you, do you know such and such a person, say at your job? And you might say, yeah, I know them. But when you say that, you just mean you know their name. Maybe you know what department they work in. Maybe you've had a few little tiny conversations with them. And then if the person said, well, do you know if this person is caring? Do they tell the truth? Are they an unselfish person? You would say, well, I don't know them, right? Because you don't have an experiential knowledge with them. The word in this text for knowledge is the word for a relational knowledge. It's to experience something, to know someone or something personally. If somebody asked you something about somebody in your family, a spouse or a child or somebody who you were close with that you live with, about their character, you would be able to say, yes, I know that person. I've seen them. I know what they're like. That's what this is talking about here. Because one day, this earth is going to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The main problem with the world today isn't that it's filled with materialism, selfishness, and violence. The main problem with the world today is that it lacks the knowledge of the glory of God. But even though it tarries, wait for it. It's coming. There's a day coming when the world is going to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. And not just a little tiny bit, not a few drops here and there, not a small minority on the narrow way that know God, but it's going to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, like the ocean. How much water is there in the ocean? A lot. It's inexhaustible. It's unstoppable. You can't swim all the way to the bottom. You can't swim across it. It's wider than you can see, and it's more beautiful than you can imagine. That's the destination of the world. The ultimate destination of the world is that it is going to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And the encouraging thing about this promise, as I've studied this text that has filled my heart, is that this is a promise that we don't have to wait for. This is a promise that you can experience now. Right? There's a part of this promise we are waiting for that knowledge of the glory of the Lord to spread out over this earth like the ocean. That hasn't happened yet. But right now, you can experience the glory of God. Right now, you can. We don't have to wait for it. It would be really discouraging if in the Bible it said, one day the earth is going to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, but you can't do it yet. You just got to wait. Then I really honestly think the weight of the world would be on our shoulders. But this glory that is going to fill the earth, you can experience today. You can experience it now. How do you do that? How do you experience the glory of God? How do you get to know the weight and the character of God for yourself? How can you grow in your understanding of his reputation? Let me just give you a very straight and simple answer. You find out through Jesus Christ. John opens his book on Jesus Christ, and he says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. When you see Jesus Christ, when you experience your relationship with Jesus Christ, you are experiencing the glory of God. The weightiness, the perfection of God, you experience it through your relationship with Jesus Christ. Every single time you open your Bible and enjoy something about Jesus Christ, every single time you open the Word and you see something that you can trust about him, you are experiencing the glory of God. Every single time a truth about him comes into your mind and fills you with peace and hope. Every time you sing a song that points you to the character of what God is like. Every time you trust him, and because you trust him, you're talking to him. You are experiencing the glory of God himself. That's what you were made for. You were designed to carry the weight of glory on your shoulders. You were designed to know him. You are designed to know your final destination. We are not designed to just know our situation. And so it might not be current events. Some people, current events just don't seem to bother them. You don't watch that much of the news. You're not on social media. But you have other things that are bothering you, other situations that you're carrying the weight of it on your shoulders. And what I'm saying here this morning is that we are not designed to carry situations on our shoulders. We are designed to carry our final destination on our shoulders. We are designed to know and experience Jesus Christ. And when we do that, we experience the glory of God, the exact same glory that one day is going to fill this entire planet. That's what we were made for. And this is a destination that is sure. It is 100% certainty. There is so much uncertainty in our world today, right? We don't know what's going to happen with the coronavirus. We don't know what's going to happen to America. We don't know what's going to happen to our health. We don't know what's going to happen with our jobs. We don't know what's going to happen to our loved ones. But here's what we do know. The earth is going to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. We don't have to know everything about the situation, but we know everything about our destination that we need to know. And isn't it satisfying to fix your heart on something that is sure, something that is at 100% certainty? We have experienced so many things that weren't true and so many uncertainties over these last couple of months. The glory of God is a certainty that you can fix your whole life on. And one day, it is going to fill this entire planet. I just want to close this morning by asking you a very simple question. Do you want to see the glory of God? Do you want to experience the glory of God for yourself? Moses, after he walked and talked with God all those years, the burning bush on Mount Sinai, talking to God face to face, Moses has a simple prayer that he prays to God. And he says, God, show me your glory. That's what he wanted. That's what he was passionate about. And I'm worried that as Christians, we are falling into the trap, and we're falling into the habit of waking up every morning and saying, show me the news. Show me the situation. What's happening today? And we have lost our passion to see God's glory. We are carrying a weight on our shoulders that we have never been meant to carry. In the past week, have you learned more about current events, or have you learned more about the character of your God? If you had to make a little T-chart on a piece of paper and write down every single current event that you heard about, read about, saw about, facts you learned over the course of the last week, and then on the other side, you wrote down, here's what I've learned about my God this week. Which list would be longer? I think that we're at times spending more time following breaking news than reading our Bible. We know specific details about the situation. We know specific details about how bad everything is getting. But we only have vague ideas about who our God is. Don't you want to know him? Don't you want to get alone with God and open up your Bible and say, God, show me your glory? I want to experience something about the uniqueness of your character. I want to see you. And when you sit down and read your Bible, that's what you need. That's the weight that we were designed to carry. To have that heart and that passion and that prayer. Trade the weight of the world for the weight of glory. You were designed to carry something, but it's not the weight of the world's sin. You are designed to experience the world's destination. So don't walk around with the weight of the world on your shoulders. Live your life filled with the weight of who God is. And live underneath the weight of this news, that one day soon the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Let's pray. Father, if I can just pray on behalf of all my brothers and sisters here and say, show us your glory. We want to see you. We want to feel the weight of your worthiness. We want to know how special you really are. So, Lord, would you give us that passion? Would you give us that hunger, not to know what's happening, but to know you, to experience who you are through our relationship with your Son, Jesus Christ. Lord, I pray if there's anyone that's here this morning that is living for this physical world, that is living for material things, that is living for their own very short temporary glory, that you would show them not just the foolishness of doing that, but would you show them that punishment is coming on them for that? That your anger burns against that sinful rebellion, and that you have promised to judge it. So, Lord, I pray that there would be no one here listening to this sermon that has not turned their heart and their life over to you and made knowing you the center of their life. Lord, we ask you that you would work in our hearts, lift up our eyes to see you and your true worth. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.